What's up guys, PK here, and in today's video, welcome to the Craftsman's Handbook, or top 10 super ridiculously in-depth and hopefully well illustrated New World crafting tips, but it just wasn't as catchy of a title. Anyways, today's video was an absolute behemoth of a video to make. I spent way over 100 hours researching it and writing the script. Been working on this video essentially since before Christmas, adding stuff, removing stuff. And so, yeah, I really hope you guys enjoy it. If you do, like, comment, subscribe, please, because this one was just so much work. In any case, I thought it was worth mentioning before we start that this is not a guide on how to level any one given crafting profession. So this video assumes that you already have your crafting skill at 200, you have a full gear set of crafting gear, you have 3 major trophies, and of course your plus 15 food. Now, with that said, we are going to talk about a couple of obvious things in the beginning. But then I promise you, we go deep. Really deep. Really, really deep. Like super deep. Oh, not that deep. Anyways, let's get started. Chapter 1. Always, always, always use timeless shards and stat mods when you're crafting. Hence the obvious part, for some of you at least. Now, as I'm sure most of you know by now, there is a crafting component in New World known as a timeless shard, and each individual gear type, not including tools and bags, has its own specific variant. Now, in order to secure a pure stat line of your choosing, that is to say, this does not function with combination stats, it only works with pure stats, on any given item that you craft, you will need both the specific shard for that item, as well as 10 of the crafting mods for that specific attribute. This allows you to lock in one of the pure stat lines, whilst also allowing you to use a separate crafting mod, thus securing a perk of your choosing on top. For Constitution, you have the Iron Godman's Insignia. Now, if I were you guys, I would put out a bunch of buy orders on these, because they are going up in price, because it seems to me that way more of these are being consumed than actually generated from looting in the world. And for that reason, since you need 10 per craft, the price is going to keep going up. Then you got the strength, that's the iron battle metal. You have the rough leather beaded straps, that's for dexterity. The softwood prayer beads, that's for focus. And lastly, you have the linen arcade embroidery, that is for intelligence. Now, keep in mind that for armor specifically, you need different timeless shards for crafting, for example, a light chest piece, as opposed to crafting a medium or a heavy chest piece. And the same exact thing goes for both boots, the pants, the gloves, and the helmet. Now, this has made crafting significantly less risky and is, in my opinion, a net positive for the game, although it does have 2 slightly annoying qualities. Number 1, unless you have the specific timeless shard for the specific armoring slot at the specifically needed weight that you need to craft, then it can be incredibly confusing to remember the exact name of precisely which shard is required for what. This is not made any easier by the fact that you can't actually categorize them by armoring weight on the market in any way, shape, or form, which reminds me, note to self, remember to make a top 10 reasons why the trading post UI sucks. But here, for your convenience, you can see all of the 3 differently weighted armoring shards needed for the 3 different categories of armoring weight classes. Number 2. For some really annoying reason, or perhaps most likely due to the executives rushing the development team, currently item patterns, which is another crafting component entirely, that depending on the name of the pattern has a certain cosmetic associated to that item that you can then apply to the item you are crafting, does not work in tandem with timeless shards, essentially forcing you to choose between crafting terribly looking good items or good looking terrible items. And considering already have a count bound cosmetics that we can change at a whim, I think we all know and can all agree that everyone is going to be choosing the former. Moving on to something that I know I've said many times before, but it might very well be the single most important thing to take away from this entire video, okay? Assuming you're not already doing it. So apologies for repeating myself, but I cannot state this clearly enough. Always use buy orders. Use buy orders. Orders, use buy. Buy orders, use orders, buy. Buy, use orders. Orders, buy, use buy orders. Okay? Anyways, I simply cannot stress this enough. I don't have time to go into too much detail here since I've said this before. So all I'm gonna say is that if you aren't using buy orders to purchase at least 2/3 of your high tier crafting materials, well, then you're doing it wrong. Period, end of story. There's no arguing here. If you're buying all of it straight off the market, you're doing it the wrong way. You're costing yourself a lot of extra gold and completely unnecessarily. All it takes is a little bit of planning, just a little bit of thinking ahead, a little bit of I'll craft in a few hours, okay? But we'll get to that in more detail a little bit later, which brings me to chapter 3. Always, always, always plan ahead before crafting and make sure you have a clear objective in mind. Are you trying to earn gold, upgrade gear, help out a friend, or some combination of both? In any case, planning ahead is very, very important because it can significantly affect what you're going to craft and how you're going to go about crafting it, which in turn significantly affects your bottom line, okay? So planning what you're going to craft tonight is something you should do when you log in the afternoon. A basic checklist would look something like this. Decide your primary, secondary, and perhaps even tertiary crafting objectives and decide precisely how many rolls you're going to attempt for each. An example would be 8 gloves, 8 boots, and 3 breastplates. Why gloves and boots? Well, gloves and boots are cheaper and thus you have more rolls per gold spent, which is why you always start with those until you get an item with a minimum of +1 strong perk. Once you have that, you can move on to a more lacking gear slot. Now, the reason you don't just craft, let's say, 20 pairs of gloves until you get the perfect piece, right? Is because if you don't have a pair of perfect gloves after, let's say, 8 rolls, well, then the price will simply increase for any given item slot as you purchase more and more of that specific timeless shard and specific ability per crafting mod. For that reason, on any given day, it's almost more cost efficient, so to speak, to target your improvements at multiple different item slots simultaneously if you're crafting a lot of items, which also has the added benefit of diversifying in the market when you try to sell the ones that you're not going to use. That way, you aren't trying to sell 20 nearly identical gear pieces that only a single class would be willing to buy. Once you decided your roles, you work out the Asmodium, Runic Leather, Phoenix Weave, Timeless Shard, crafting mods, pristine gems required for the whole thing, and put in the specific buy orders for the exact amount of extra materials you need to do the whole set. Although always keep in mind that materials are often cheaper in the afternoon, so you might want to purchase at least some of the stat mods and crafting mods as well as the timeless shards early on whilst the prices are lower, since buy orders for the most expensive varieties of these timeless shards don't always go through. Hence also why it's better to diversify. And remember to check up on your Asmodium buy orders and put in new ones if people overcut you. Number 2, and this is some of the obvious stuff, check that you have all your 3 major crafting trophies up. You can do that in your bio in the bottom right corner. Double check that you have the town buff active tonight in the city you plan to craft in. If not, purchase it now so that it can be finished and ready for later. Number 4, have your gear set and earring plus the +15 crafting food ready in that same time. And lastly, have a specific criteria for how good the item needs to be before you equip it as opposed to selling it. This is because you might otherwise fall into the trap of equipping a slightly better item multiple times only to craft a slightly better one later tonight or maybe tomorrow, making the previous one redundant and only worth sort of the cost of the salvageable materials. For that reason, it's a good idea to say, okay, this is my minimum before I equip it, and if it's not better than that, then I'm gonna sell it instead. Even if it's better than the one I have equipped now, I know that if I keep going, I'll get a better one statistically in a couple of days, and so I'm choosing to sell this one instead and get some of my investment back. Chapter 4. Always, always, always make sure that you sell your items in a town that has low to medium trading taxes, and preferably one where you have a high territory standing. In a nutshell, every time you craft something or list an item on the market, you are paying a fixed fee associated with the item you are crafting, minus a couple of discounts, which can vary greatly based on a multitude of different factors, varying from the cards you chose as you leveled up your reputation standing, to whether or not your faction owns a specific fort on the map. Now, always keep in mind when you're selling items that you can see precisely how much you pay to A, list the given item on the market at your desired price for a desired period of time, and B, how much of your profits your super duper greedy douchebag server overlords are charging you, because this is one of only 2 to 3 fucking towns that can afford to upgrade their fucking crafting station. Why the fuck did we lose fucking Brightwood? Fuck's sake. What are you looking at? I dropped my spacebar, okay? Anyways, in a nutshell, there are 3 different factors to keep in mind. Number 1, the trading tax set by the controlling faction, which can vary from a minimum of 2.5% all the way to the maximum of 25%. Number 2, your territory card bonus discounts, which start at 5% on the first card and can theoretically go all the way up to 62.78%. But most people will find that they hit a hypothetical wall of diminishing returns right around the 30% mark, as you'll get less than 1% per card after that. Number 3, your faction being in control of the Everfall fort for a minus 5% bonus to trading taxes, whereas the Ebonscale fort gives minus 5% in refining taxes and the Reekwater fort gives minus 5% in crafting taxes. Keep in mind that we are talking about controlling the fort, not owning the area, and the bonus is global and applies to any and all players from that faction. Which brings us to the Craftsman's cards, which is the reward you get for earning territory standing in any given area. Now, I would focus primarily on storage in the beginning, but both decreasing your crafting fee as well as your trading taxes should go all the way up to around 30% once you progress further into the game. Lastly, I think it's worth keeping in mind that even if you feel forced to craft your items in Everfall, Windsward, Brightwood, because they might be the only cities with upgraded crafting stations, it can be more than worth it to craft the items there, but then recall to your house in a different city with lower trading taxes to sell the items, since this is by far the most significant factor eating into your potential profits. Chapter 5. Never ever ever be delusional about the pricing of your average item rolls. Now, this comes back to what the goal of crafting is all about. At the end of the day, this is an MMORPG, and at least to some extent, the point of earning gold still comes back to the goal of improving your own gear. And so it's important that you can keep the wheel spinning, so to speak. Keep the rolls going so the park ride is open every day and you can keep rolling items until you hit that best in slot. Now, the only way to do that is to ensure that the non-best in slot items that you craft are in fact sellable, and that you do in fact sell them in a reasonable amount of time. Because if you don't, well, then you'll simply run out of gold, which in turn will make you run out of materials, which in turn will make you close the park. Now, if you get an actual best in slot, there are a few things to keep in mind. Firstly, don't let people in global chat tell you that the price is crazy. If it's an actual true best in slot, and we'll get to the difference momentarily, then the supply of equivalent items is so scarce that the truth is most people simply can't afford your item, and thus it can be very hard to sell it for what it's actually worth. Which brings me to the next point. What is your item actually worth? Pricing the gear you craft can be extremely difficult, and as I've said in some of my previous Jewelcrafting videos, an item is only worth what someone is willing to pay for it, and sometimes it can be very difficult to find that one person that both needs your item and has the funds and willingness to pay for it. I recall crafting an amulet at one point before Timeless Shards were even a thing that had something like health, divine, and luck with pure focus, and although it's not a best in slot, it's still a really good item. Now, at the time, I got plenty of offers from healers when I tried to sell it in global chat, but literally no one was bidding over 10 to 11,000, which was obviously ridiculously low, but it was early on, and so I honestly wasn't really sure what the item was actually worth, since there were very few pieces to realistically compare it to. And so after I had tried and failed to sell it in global chat for somewhere around 30,000 gold as a bare minimum, I gave up and instead listed it on the market for 39,995, thinking in my head that perhaps I was completely delusional for wanting that much because of all the lowball offers I had gotten. But I posted it all the same, and as it turns out, someone quite literally bought it before I had walked from the market in Everfall to the stone cutting station in Everfall, at which point I started wondering if I just ripped myself off. Which brings me to the next chapter, Chapter 6. Check the market before listing your items. The fact is, you almost certainly cannot find an actual best in slot item on the market at any given time. and thus you most likely can't just purchase it, regardless of how much gold you have. For the most part, in my experience, best in slot items will be sold in the global chat in order to avoid the massive listing fees and tax payments on items worth north of 100,000 gold. And different best in slot items will be worth vastly different amounts and can be very hard to sell for the very simple fact that 99.9% of players can't afford what your item is worth. Now, this is probably more opinion than fact, but to me, an actual best in slot is an item where it's nearly indisputable that it has the single best combination of perks. Let me give you an example. I made a video at one point I made the single best amulet in the game. It was a pure constitution amulet with health, divine, and purify, which I think any player worth their salt would agree is the single best combination of perks possible in the game on an amulet. And not just for any one class, but for any class. No matter what you play and how you played, you need that amulet. And so that to me is an example of a true best in slot item. By comparison, you might make a ring that has constitution, thrust damage, burning, and refreshing move, which would be a pretty insane ring for a musket user. But is it a best in slot when it doesn't have dexterity? Would it be better that it had crit chance as opposed to thrust damage? Is burning really worth it just because of powder shot? Is refreshing move better than refreshing? Now, I'm not going to answer all of these questions for you here, but I think it illustrates what I mean very well. Two very good but different musket players might disagree on one or more of the answers to those questions. So not only can you only sell it as a best in slot item to a musket user, but perhaps only half or even less of the musket users will be convinced that this is an actual best in slot for them, and so you should be prepared for the fact that such a ring won't bring in the same ridiculous price tag as the aforementioned amulet, which my friend, by the way, because it was technically his item, sold for 136,500 gold. Which brings us to chapter 7, how to both sell and evaluate your items. Now, first things first, let's just get one thing really straight. Please stop spamming a full list of purple trash items in global chat, since half the time no one will even care, and if you do manage to sell one of them, in my experience you just end up spending more time selling that one mediocre item than I personally find to be worth it. Now, I'm not saying that no purple item is worth trying to sell in global chat, but in my experience you should exclusively post perfect purples or better, since people won't bother to look at the full list if the two first items they see are mediocre. Now, there are a lot of factors that go into estimating the worth of your item. Number 1, material cost per roll. A heavy breastplate will be a lot more expensive than an identically rolled heavy glove. This is because the breastplate would require anywhere between 16 and 20 asmodium, whereas the heavy glove would only require 4. Number 2, item quality. A perfect purple versus a lacking legendary. People tend to be willing to pay extra simply because a legendary looks or feels better, even if the third perk is completely irrelevant. Number 3, supply versus demand. If too many people are crafting a specific type of item, then naturally the price of said item goes down significantly. A classic example of this is the ring. There are 3 different item slots related to jewelry, and everyone only needs one of each. But the ring is by far the safest one to roll from a standpoint of not getting unusable perks. In other words, it has the lowest ratio of useless to useful perks as far as jewelry is concerned. It is for this reason that the tendency right from the beginning in jewelcrafting was to craft more rings than amulets and earrings, which in turn flooded the market with mediocre rings, thus devaluating the price of rings in the process. Number 4, niche versus universality. Now, this is yet another example of supply and demand. 2 equally good and equally rare item rolls can vary greatly in price if 30% of the server wants to purchase one versus 5% of the server wanting to purchase another. And lastly, we have what I'm going to call the psychological effect. Now, this one can be very hard to quantify and might vary from person to person, so take this one with a grain of salt. But in my experience, there are certain equally irrelevant perks that can have varying degrees of influence over how much people are willing to pay. I think this is at least partially a matter of aesthetics, but I also think there are some psychological effect at play that simply makes you feel like certain useless perks are just more useless than others. Last example of this would be crafting an earring. Now, I'd be willing to bet you that an earring with which is generating refreshing toast and cooking mastery, which is completely and entirely irrelevant because it won't make it any harder for the tank to get aggro. But there's just something about cooking mastery that you look at it and you go, that is just extra useless. It's not just, you know what I mean? It looks worse, and it is so in your face useless as far as combat is concerned, it bothers your eye, right? You look at it, it's a legendary, you go, legendary. And then you see Cooking Master and you go, for fuck's sake, right? So it just devaluates the item for no logical reason. But moving on, should you manage to craft an actual or close to best in slot item, then for the love of science, don't decide to sell it for cheap just because there was only one person whispering you with a 10k offer in the first 10 minutes. Ask your friends, ask your company, what do you think this item is worth? What would you be willing to pay for it if you had the gold? And if you struggle to find a buyer for an item that you feel like is certainly worth north of 60-70k, then here's the tip. Open up your map. Hover your mouse over Everfall, Brightwood, or Windsward. Note down the names of the companies in charge of those towns. Open up the guild tab and find the guild in the list. Note down the name of the governor. Link the item in a private message to them and ask if someone in their company might be interested in the item that you're selling, and just tell them they can get back to you whenever, if they want to purchase it. This way you ensure that your insane item is in fact advertised to a bunch of people that can actually afford it, and by a person that they will actually listen to. If you think about it, all of the super rich companies have plenty of gold, right? They have plenty of gold. For them, the hard part is actually finding the items to purchase. This might seem counterintuitive, but trust me, because even rolling the items for everyone in the guild, it's going to be a mammoth task, even when you earn 1 million a week, for example, by owning Everfall. Trust me, 1 million won't get you as far as you might think in terms of rolling best in slot items. Trust me, I've done the math, we'll get to the math, and 1 million will not gear up an entire person, okay? 1 million gold, let me say that again, is not enough, statistically, to get full best in slot gear on a person, a single person. So if you just apply that logic, and that's from a crafting perspective, so if you apply that logic, now realize that they have 100 members, possibly, minimum of 50, I would say, that needs best in slot gear, right? Their problem is actually finding the items to purchase, okay? So just a little tip to keep in mind if you're trying to sell a really good item. Which brings us to chapter 8, armoring. So, in a nutshell, there are essentially 2 different viable methods with which to approach armoring. But before we get to those, let's first talk about what perks you can get, which ones you want, and how they exclude one another. So in total on any piece of armor, there are 94 different perks separated into 9 different exclusive categories, meaning 2 perks from the same category will exclude one another from rolling on the same item. Now, there are 12 weapons with 6 abilities each, so 72 different ability perks. Then you have crit defense, debuff duration, damage absorption, cooldown reduction, durability, luck, affliction resistance, and lastly, and also very much leastly, you have gathering luck. Now, excluding the ability perks, that leaves us with, roughly speaking, 9 good perks and 13 bad perks. But before we get to the 2 methods, what does a piece of best in slot armor really look like? Well, the way I see it, there are 2 kinds of best in slot gear. The first one has A, an appropriate ability perk for whichever weapon you're using, B, it has resilience, and C, it has either a secondary defensive perk or a cooldown reduction perk. But not all weapons really want an ability perk, at least not for all slot pieces. So the second type of best in slot would have A, resilience, B, a secondary defensive perk, and C, a cooldown reduction perk. But let's talk a little bit about the perks. So the S tier perks are going to be your core ability perks and resilience. Resilience simply being the best perk you can roll next to the appropriate ability perk. Then we have the A tier perks like Invigorated, Freedom, Refreshing Evasion, and Refreshing. Then you have the B tier, or sort of the secondary defensive perks, which are going to be things like Vigor, Physical Aversion, and Elemental Aversion. Now, I've been told that Vigor doesn't actually work at the moment, but even if that is true, I would not worry too much about it, since it will most likely be fixed in the upcoming patch. But these are slightly worse than Invigorated and Freedom as far as PvP is concerned, but they're still good perks. Then in the C tier, we have Refreshing Ward. Now, Refreshing Ward simply doesn't stack up next to Refreshing and Refreshing Evasion. In my opinion, there's no argument, no scenario, no build in which you would want Refreshing Ward over either Refreshing or Refreshing Evasion. In the D tier, we have Luck. Now, the reason I've put Luck in the D tier as opposed to down in the F tier, which we'll get to in a moment, is simply because at least it has PvE uses. At least it's good for dungeons, right? But in the F tier, we have pretty much everything else. Corruption resistance, blight resistance, logging, harvesting, mining, skinning, luck, ancient ward, angry earth beast, corrupted, lost, and reinforced. Now, this might change to some degree. Like, we could possibly take all of the wards, the beast ward, angry earth, ancient, put them up into the D tier once the new patch comes out, because in that scenario, there might actually be good uses for some of these pieces. But as far as PvP is concerned, pretty much all of these perks are useless. Now, there are essentially two different ways to go about crafting armor. Personal crafting and arbitrary crafting. Starting out with personal crafting. Now, for personal crafting, you're going to use a timeless shard, and you can in fact apply a non-neutral stat line, such as for example Focus, in combination with an appropriate crafting mod for an ability perk of your choosing. The important part here, of course, being that it has to be the right stat line in combination with the right ability perk, such as Focus with a life staff perk as an example, and this is by far the fastest and easiest way to obtain a full gear set with appropriate ability perks. The downside is that you are rolling on that secondary perk. Now, there are 9 good options and 13 bad options, giving you a 40.9% chance to roll one good perk next to your ability perk, which means on average you need to craft 2.44444444 to infinity pieces to get a single piece with that +1 good perk. Now, statistically, you have a 4.54% chance to get resilience. That means you'd need to craft roughly 22 pieces, slightly less because of legendary rolls. So roughly speaking, 19 to 20 pieces, statistically, to roll a single piece with both your ability perk and resilience. And you'd have, roughly speaking, a 0.25% to 0.3% chance to roll both resilience and a tertiary good perk, which is roughly 300 to 400 rolls. That's a lot of gold. That's very expensive. Which brings us to arbitrary crafting. Now, arbitrary crafting is all about earning gold. So the idea here is that instead of applying a specific ability perk, you're going to go to the faction shop and you're going to purchase something known as a chunk of consecrated iron. You can also purchase them from the market if you're low on faction tokens, but they essentially cost 3,000 faction tokens and 10 gold. And so what you're going to do is you're going to craft stat neutral gear. In other words, you're always going to use a timeless shard. You're always going to put in Constitution, and then you're going to put in, on top of that, the chunk of consecrated iron, which is going to guarantee the perk resilience. Now, the advantage here, of course, is that statistically speaking, you're way more likely to get a piece with a good ability perk and resilience, which makes for sellable items that are worth a lot of gold. The downside, of course, is that you have 72 different ability perks across 12 different weapons. Now, you can start out by cutting them down the middle and saying, well, half of them are going to be useless because half of them are going to be for abilities that people don't use for that given weapon. So half of them are going to be trash at a minimum. Then you have certain ability perks for a weapon like the bow, for example, where you don't really need, even for the abilities you use, you don't really need the ability perk because in a PvP setting, some of them are pretty much irrelevant. But nonetheless, even when you do the math as such, you're still statistically more likely to come out with a piece that turns a profit because it has that guaranteed resilience and a given ability perk. Now, of course, the downside here is that the chances of actually hitting an ability perk for a weapon and for an ability that you yourself use is very, very low. So this should primarily be done as a method to sell the gear so that you can then in turn afford to do personal crafting. Okay, so you want to do arbitrary crafting to earn gold to do personal crafting, if that makes sense. And yeah, that's pretty much all you need to know about armoring. Chapter 9, Jewelcrafting, aka my area of expertise. Now, first things first, when doing jewelcrafting, you should always use a timeless shard, and you should almost always use the universally useful stat line of Constitution. Now, there is one or two exceptions to this, which I will mention along the way, but you should always use a timeless shard and nearly always go for Constitution. Now, the first thing you need to decide when you're doing jewelcrafting, other than which piece you're going to craft, amulet, ring, or earring, is which gem to apply. Now, there are 4 different options, essentially, as far as PvP usefulness goes. That's going to be your cut pristine onyx for full physical damage absorption, your cut pristine opal for full elemental damage absorption, your cut pristine diamond for big part physical, small part elemental, and your cut pristine malachite for big part elemental, small part physical. Now, starting out with the amulet, you have 26 perks separated across 8 different categories: health, healing, proc, buff duration, defense, cooldown reduction, luck, and gathering luck. Now, once you've selected your gem, you need to decide what crafting mod to use. And 99.999999999% of the time, you're going to be using a draught of ironwood sap to apply the universally useful perk of health. Everyone needs health. No one doesn't need health. If you don't have any health, you're dead. Okay, so health is always going to be useful, and it's a fairly affordable crafting mod. They cost anywhere between 50 and 800 gold. It varies a lot, but currently, as far as I can tell, they're at around 100 to 200 gold a piece. And essentially what you're looking for a best in slot is going to be something like health, divine, and purify. Now, health and divine are your 2 primary attractors. So any role that has any combination of health, divine, and purify is going to be really, really valuable. Of course, you're trying to avoid things like gathering luck and luck. You're also trying to avoid a lot of the defense perks like arcane protection, lightning, nature, ice, fire, void, strike, whereas slash and thrust are slightly better because they apply to a greater variety of weapons, and particularly thrust protection is really good. Musket, bow, spear, rapier, and shield are all thrust damage, making that slightly better than all the other defensive perks. Buff durations are alright. Empowered, alacrity, fortified for 14% longer, but they're not amazing. Mana recovery, not the best. Fortified recovery, not the best either, actually. Stamina recovery and purify, though, amazing. Absolutely amazing. Then you have your cooldown reduction perks. Of course, refreshing evasion and refreshing, gonna be slightly better than refreshing ward. So this is essentially what you're looking at. Now, it is also possible to craft with either a chunk of adamant for purify or a shard of crystallized azoth for divine if the draught of ironwood saps are crazily expensive on your server. Moving on to the least risky piece, we have the ring. 25 perks separated across 8 different categories, and your crafting mod of choosing here is going to be the draught of corrupted ichor for that crit chance. Now, there's a couple of different reasons for that. First of all, pretty much everyone needs crit chance. Not everyone, but pretty much everyone needs crit chance, right? Keen awareness, it's a great perk, but also it has the added advantage of being in the damage type category, which means you exclude arcane, lightning, nature, ice, fire, void, strike, slash, and thrust damage. Thrust damage can be good, but most of the time you're going to be crafting with keen awareness because thrust damage is nonetheless specific to certain weapons, whereas crit chance isn't. So you're going to be crafting with Draught of Corrupted Ichor. Then you have things like debuff duration, poison, bloodletting, burning, crippling, enfeebling, infected. Some of these are good, some of them aren't. I think the bleed and disease are the slightly better ones here, possibly also the slow. Then you have procs, leeching and siphoning. Leeching being really, really good. Any ring with leeching and crit chance can earn you up towards like 20 to 25k gold. Then you have hardy, that's more stamina. That's pretty much every heavy bruiser needs to have this because it gives them an extra dodge. They're heavy users, so their dodges cost 50 stamina. If you double dodge as a heavy user and you don't have hardy, well, then you're going to be slowed for 10% until your stamina bar has regenerated fully. By having hardy, you can do 2 dodges and still have your stamina recover normally. You have mana, brilliant, healing, sacred, luck, and then your cooldown reduction perks. Now, sacred is another way to go about it. Now, this is one of the exceptions where you can craft with something other than Constitution if you happen to come across a sliver of consecrated iron, and that is a crafting mod that can net you anywhere between 3 and 10,000 gold a piece. So if you craft with sacred, then you can apply something like focus, for example, for a hefty profit. Now, a best in slot for the ring is going to vary depending on what class you're looking for, unlike with the amulet, where it's pretty much universally the same perks you're looking for. With the ring, it's a bit more weapon specific. But if you ever net yourself a ring with crit chance, sacred, and leeching, that's 100k gold right there. Any Void Gauntlet user is gonna jizz in their pants, okay? I'm telling you that much. In any case, let's move on to the earring, which is also the riskiest of all the crafts, and that is despite the fact that it only has 21 perks separated into 8 different categories. So what makes the earring so risky? Well, it has 8 different categories: regen, consume, cooldown reduction, consume add, consume, threat, trade skill, luck, and cooldown reduction. Now threat, that's 3 completely useless perks related to aggro. Trade skill, that's 6 completely useless perks: Arcanist Mastery, Armor, Engineer, Jewelcrafting, Weaponsmithing, and of course lastly, my ultimate nemesis, Cooking Mastery. Oh god, oh god. Why cooking? Why do you do this to me? But of course you're trying to avoid all of those. You're also trying to avoid luck, duplicating toast, to some extent mana toast. That's suddenly a lot of perks you're trying to avoid. Refreshing ward, not the greatest either. So you're suddenly left with a very small pool of good rolls. Now, as far as crafting goes, you have 2 options: the cheap one and the expensive one. The cheap one is going to be the Draught of Azalea Nectar, which is going to guarantee you the regenerating perk, health regen, which is a really good perk, again a universally useful perk that everyone wants. Then you have the expensive method, which is going to be crafting with high quality tallow. That's going to apply the perk Refreshing Toast, and a high quality tallow can net you anywhere between 3 and 8,000 gold a piece. So no small amount, and essentially that's going to give you Refreshing Toast, which is cooldown reduction for your potions. At 600 gear score, it applies 28% cooldown reduction at a 30-second cooldown, giving you 8.4 second reduction, aka a cooldown of 21.6 seconds. So at best in slot here, what you're looking for is going to be any combination really of regenerating and refreshing toast. Is going to net you a big profit, and if on top of that you can also apply something like cooldown reduction, possibly purifying toast, then you have yourself a piece worth way over 100,000. Which brings us finally to our last chapter. Chapter 10. Weaponsmithing. Now the problem with weaponsmithing is, well, how do I put this? Pants. It's pants. The problem is pants. How do I get a pair of pants? And can you even craft without a pair? I mean, who the fuck wants to stand in the middle of Everfall and craft in their goddamn underwear? I'll tell you who. No one. On a serious note though, weaponsmithing pants only drop from the final boss at the top of the tower in Eden Grove called Malevolence. And they sell from anywhere between 30 to 100,000 gold. So yeah, maybe you should just stick to armoring. In any case, weaponsmithing. Now, weaponsmithing is going to be a bit of a complicated one to wrap around in a simple manner, for a couple of different reasons. First of all, you have melee versus ranged. Second of all, you have sort of a much wider spectrum of perceived good and bad perks depending on what weapon we're talking about. So I am going to have to generalize a bit here when talking about different perks, but I'll try my best as we go through the perks to mention some of the caveats for one given perk that might be S tier on one weapon, but F tier on another weapon. But in total, there are 49 different weapon perks. 47 of them can roll on melee weapons, 10 of them are exclusive to melee weapons. Then you have 39 different perks that can roll on ranged weapons, 2 of which are exclusive, leaving 37 neutral perks. And of course, as with any of these crafts, you should always use a timeless shard. And I think stat-wise, again, the weapon is another case where you want to go for the non-neutral stat lines. You don't want to apply Constitution to your weapons unless you absolutely have to for your build to make sense. Primarily, you want to use whichever is its primary stat, both for the case of its sellability, but also just because you can always stack Constitution by simply applying more points into the stat. Not to mention the fact that most jewelry is going to have pure Constitution, which means it's going to be easier to balance out your build if you keep the Constitution to your jewelry and then try to get your primary stat on armor and weapons. And if you approach it with that mentality, then it's never going to be a disaster if you do have one piece that has Constitution. Then that's totally fine. But crafting-wise, you want to apply the primary attribute. Now, lastly, before we get to the crafting specifics, I think there are a few things to keep in mind, which are all of the 600 gear score named legendaries that you can craft through the various different crafting professions, such as weaponsmithing, engineering, and arcana. Now, the reason I think this is important is because they are sort of the baseline measuring stick versus which you should compare any given one craft, because these are guaranteed crafts. They're easy to craft once you have your profession up, they are relatively cheap, and you know what you're getting. In other words, I feel like they're sort of a good template to sort of measure your craft against, to say, is the piece I made better or worse than what you can craft as a guarantee? So I feel like it has to be better than that for it to be a weapon that I would actually equip, because otherwise you could just go level a profession, get it up to maximum, and have a guaranteed legendary there. So first of all, we have weaponsmithing. Now, weaponsmithing allows you to craft the Dark Sky, 30 strength, fortifying whirlwind, keenly fortified, and enchanted. Not terrible. It has at least 2 good perks, an ability perk that I personally don't use, but it has enchanted, which is definitely one of the best perks, and keenly fortified, which is not terrible. Jewelcrafting, not that good of a weapon, since you want to have the ability perk on your actual gear. Chain Void is pretty terrible, and whilst Keenly Empowered is a good perk in of itself, it lacks the added crit chance to synergize with. Moving on to Voidbringer's Rapier, which on the surface looks pretty good, since the combination of Keen and Keenly Jacked synergizes really well, but at the same time I think it's only slightly better than an average roll, simply because of the category that the Rapier falls into. Often it's more of a means to an end, and often functions as your primary survivability tool as opposed to your primary damage source, and for that reason I don't think these are the best rolls for most builds. And lastly, we have Whisper of the Wood, which I'm hopelessly unqualified to talk about, since the sword is quite literally my least leveled weapon, so I'm gonna leave this one open to interpretation, but my first impression is that it's not that great. So moving on to engineering, we got the Warpwood Bow, which has Enfeebling Poison Shot, that's the one ability perk you might actually want on the bow. Then you have Warble, extra headshot damage, and Keenly Jacked. This is a pretty decent combination, and Warpwood is definitely one of the better named legendaries you can craft. Which brings us to the awesomely named Musket of Unseen Power, which isn't the only powerful thing that I have that you can't see. Which also has Vorpal, which is even better for the musket than it is for the bow, as well as Empowering Shooter Stance, which is definitely one of the ability perks that you want, and lastly it has Chain Lightning, which is pretty meh. Now moving on to the Soulforged Spear, we have Enfeebling Skewer, Keen Speed, and Vicious, which in of itself isn't terrible at all, but the weapon still falls a little bit flat once you realize that 2 of the good perks are dependent upon critical hits on a weapon without any added critical hit chance. Which brings us to Axe of the Abyss, which has Keen Berserk, which is an ability perk you definitely want on your armor. Sturdy, which I can only assume is completely useless on a hatchet, and of course Enchanted, which is really good, so at least it's got that going for it. Which brings us lastly to Arcana, starting out with the Void Gauntlet Nothingness, which is already kinda cheating because it is the single only one of these named legendaries that is actually tradable, which I'm 99.9% certain was simply a mistake by Amazon when they implemented the Void Gauntlet that they simply didn't bother to fix. As well as also being the only one of the crafted named legendaries to hold dual attributes. On top of that, it has both Enchanted and Lifestealing, which is amazing, and finished off with Mortal Siphoning, which is completely and utterly useless. Which brings us to Crystalline Curse, which has Refreshing Move, Enchanted, and Unending Thaw, which I think is definitely one of the best perk combinations of all of these named legendaries. Of course, preferably you want to have Unending Thaw on your actual armor, but aside from that, this weapon has really good perks that would be really hard to beat with a random roll. Which brings us to the Firestaff Meteor Trail, which for whatever reason had a bugged out image. It has Siphoning Incinerate, which is terrible, Keenly Empowered, which is amazing, and Mortal Refreshment, which is terrible. And considering it has no crit chance to synergize with Keenly Empowered, all in all, this is probably one of the single worst craftable named legendaries. That is, except for Gortan's Tainted Staff. Now this is a life staff without Blessed, and that's pretty much all you need to know. A life staff without Blessed is like a car without wheels, which in turn makes it so worthless that even if it were in fact a tradable item, which it isn't, I would probably salvage it for materials before even bothering to list it on the trading post. Now there are a total of 56 different weapon perks, split across 10 different categories. Now there are 53 of them that can roll on melee weapons, with 10 exclusive melee weapon perks. There are 45 perks that can roll for any given ranged weapons, 2 of which are exclusive to ranged weapons, leaving 43 you count the ability perks as neutral, because of course any given one weapon can only roll ability perks for that given weapon. Now the 10 different categories are crit chance, damage con, accuracy, crit headshot, procs, blocking, damage category, on kill, threat, and weapon abilities. But let's start at the top with the S tier. First things first, you have crit chance. Now crit chance is, in my opinion, pretty much, with the small exception of the life staff, a universal S tier. Now there's a couple of different reasons for this. First of all, it's damage. Damage is always good. But it's better than that, because there's also a bunch of other perks that are predicated on actually having a critical hit. Things like plate crits, vicious, keenly jacked, keenly empowered, keenly fortified, keen speed. All of these are predicated on getting a critical hit, which means having crit chance on most weapons is going to be an S tier, simply because the chances of having a second perk that then works in tandem with critical chance increases the likelihood of having a really strong weapon. Now keep in mind that for dexterity weapons you actually have a guaranteed critical hit once every 10 seconds, assuming you perform a dodge roll. For that reason, crit chance is not as important for dex weapons in particular as it is for example, strength weapons. In other words, crit chance is slightly less important for dexterity weapons and slightly more important for strength and intelligence weapons, whereas crit damage is slightly more important for dexterity weapons and slightly less important for things like strength weapons. Moving on to vicious, crit damage. Another perk that's going to be great most of the time. Now, as a perk, I think it's a bit overrated for melee weapons. And what I mean by that is not to say that it's a bad perk, it's a great perk. But I feel like for the perk to be S tier on a melee weapon, you need to have crit chance on both your ring and on your weapon. Otherwise, I feel like it gets outperformed by other perks. Whereas on ranged weapons, you also get a critical hit whenever you perform a headshot, which means crit damage is going to be better as a perk for ranged weapons than it's going to be for melee weapons. But with that said, it's still an all-around good perk. Even in the worst case scenario, it'd still be an A perk or a B perk, even for a melee weapon. Moving on, we have Enchanted. Now Enchanted, 9.5% light and heavy attack damage, which can be applied with a worn whetstone, is again, with the exception of a life staff, pretty much a universally amazing perk, because it's essentially 9.5% extra attack damage on all of your attacks, with the abilities being the only exception. That makes it a really great perk. Then you have for ranged weapons something like Vorpal, 14% extra headshot damage. In particularly for the musket, this is an S tier, but even for the bow, I'd argue this is one of the best perks you can get. It's essentially like Vicious, except it only applies to the headshots, but it is then 3% extra compared to Vicious. Now this next perk is, in my opinion, the single best perk you can roll on a great axe. And really on most strength weapons. Not on all, but on most strength weapons. And for some reason it's been completely overlooked by so many people. I think 90% of people probably have no idea that this is an amazing perk. That's a bit of a stretch maybe, but I genuinely think so. And it's partially because it wasn't in the game until the 1.1 update, I believe. And it's not present on any drop in the game, which means there's not a single drop anywhere out there in the world that has this on it. So it is exclusively applied to crafting, and it's called Thwarting Strikes. Deal 11% additional damage with active grit. It's applied through a drop of Ironwood Sap, a crafting mod that can sell for anywhere between 2 and 10,000 gold a piece, which drops from Ironwood trees, by the way. And this perk, it's essentially equivalent to Enchanted in that it's all of your normal attacks, both heavy and light, are going to deal 11% extra damage, because when you have 300 strength, all of your attacks, light and heavy, are gonna have grit. And this essentially adds 11% extra damage to grit attacks. And this also applies to any ability that happens to have grit. There are plenty of situations where this is a great perk, so it's essentially a better version of Enchanted, in my opinion, assuming you have that 300 strength threshold. Moving on to A tier. Now here we're gonna have a couple of perks that again will vary greatly depending on the weapon we're talking about. Really good perks like Refreshing Move, 2.8% light heavy attack, cooldown reduction. This is one of those perks that might be S tier on the rapier, but it's at best a D tier on the musket, right? Then you have things like 5% life stealing, S tier on the hammer for sure. Again, F tier on the musket. Things like Keenly Jacked are almost universally great, again, excluding the life staff, again, but for aggressive weapons, Keenly Jacked is essentially just extra damage, assuming you have that crit chance. The same goes for Keenly Empowered. Now, Keenly Empowered empowers you 15%, which means that you essentially get 15% extra damage for 5 seconds after performing a critical hit with a 10-second cooldown. That's amazing. Then you have things like Trenchant Strikes, which is exclusively a melee perk. Fully charged heavy attacks deal 14% additional damage. The reason I think this is at least an A tier is despite the fact that it's predicated on heavy attacks, which is a negative, because usually when you DPS in PvP, you're going to be using more light attacks as far as melee is concerned. But I do think here the guarantee of 14% additional damage is enough to put it up at an A tier. In the B tier, you have things like Keenly Fortified and Keen Speed. Now, one of the reasons I've put Keenly Fortified in B and Keenly Empowered in A is that Keenly Fortified is 10% damage reductions from all damage types for 3 seconds with 10-second cooldown, whereas Keenly Empowered is 15% damage of all damage types for 5 seconds, but still with 10% cooldown. But of course, the great thing here is that you can have Keenly Empowered on your Great Axe, and then you can have Keenly Fortified on your Hammer, because Keenly Empowered doesn't stack with Keenly Empowered. So if you have it on both weapons, they wouldn't be able to overlap one another anyways. And so having Keenly Fortified on the Hammer, for example, when you want to be defensive, when you're trying to disable your opponent and stay alive, and then have Keenly Empowered on your Great Axe would be to your advantage. Then you have things like Trenchant Crits, Trenchant Rend, and Trenchant Recovery. Fully charged heavy attacks deal 19% additional crit damage. I feel like that one is too specific, that's why it's a B tier. It's not that it's a bad perk, but it's predicated on both a heavy attack and on a critical hit. That's not great. Then you have Trenchant Rend. Fully charged heavy attacks apply Rend for 7 seconds, reducing damage absorption by 14% on a 12-second cooldown. Again, not terrible, it's decent for initiation. It doesn't strike me as being amazing, but it's definitely a good perk. Again, it will vary slightly depending on what weapon we're talking about. I would definitely put it on a hatchet. I probably would not put it on a Great Axe, simply because the heavy attack charge time is much lower for the hatchet, and so with the hatchet it might actually be worth it, but I am not a huge hatchet player, so feel free to correct me down in the comments if I'm completely crazy here. Again, not saying that it's the best hatchet perk out there, just saying it would be better for a hatchet in my opinion than it would be, for example, for a Great Axe. Then you have Trenchant Recovery. Fully charged heavy attacks heal the player for 28% of damage dealt. Now, this is one of the many perks that were nerfed in the actual release. And again, I don't think it's a bad perk for something like the Hammer, for example. Again, because it's a defensive weapon. But at the same time, I'm not convinced that it's ever worth it as opposed to many of the other perks that it would thus exclude, which is why I've put it in the B tier as it's a good perk, but for most weapons, it's not the one you're looking for. Then in the C tier, I've put all of the ability perks. But of course, this is very, very arbitrary. Now, the truth is, for most weapons, most of the time, having an ability perk on the weapon is a net negative. Why? Because that excludes another perk you could have had. And the truth is, you could have just had that ability perk on your armor. In almost all cases, almost. Because if you want to have 3 ability perks for both of your weapons, well, then at least one of them will have to have one ability perk. So it's not terrible in that you might craft a full gear set, and then there's one ability perk left that you don't have. And so it varies from weapon to weapon. But for most weapons, most of the time, it's not what you're looking for. Okay, it's not a best in slot thing, perhaps with the exception possibly of the Void Gauntlet. Don't hold me up on this, but I would say most of the time, it's not that it's a bad roll. It's not that you see the ability perk and go, I don't want that in all cases. But it's not going to be a best in slot thing because you could simply apply that same thing to your armor, and so you would preferably have something else. But it is an above average filler perk. That is to say, comparatively to so many other things you don't want, it's a good perk, right? And you can sort of build around it on your gear if necessary. Then we have D tier. All of the chains, Chain Arcane, Chain Fire, Ice, Lightning, Void, so on and so forth, they are pretty bad. That's the honest truth. The actual damage that jumps between targets is like 10 to 12%. Don't hold me up on that, but I believe it's something along those lines with a 2-second cooldown, which is not a lot. Ruinous siege damage. Pretty much the only weapon you want siege damage on is muskets, and that's specifically for wars. And specifically for wars where people use siege weapons, which of course can vary as well. So it's a very niche perk that is, I assume, amazing in that one specific scenario, but in the greater whole, not exactly what you want, even on your PvP musket. Siphoning Blow, you gain 2.8% mana per hit, 10-second cooldown. Just irrelevant. 2.8% mana per hit on a 10-second cooldown. Terrible, terrible. Sure Footing and Sturdy. Now these are both related to blocking. You can either move 20% faster while blocking, or Sturdy, you take 9.6% less damage while blocking. So the Sure Footing, useless, essentially. It's a D tier because it's not as useless as some of the others I'm about to mention, but it's still just not good. You don't want it on your weapon. Sturdy, it's one of those perks where for PvE, it's the best thing to have on a shield. You absolutely need to have it on your tower shield. But in any other scenario than that, it's useless. You don't want it on your weapon, right? You want it on your shield, not on your weapon. Then we have the F tier. Damage categories: Ancient, Angry Earth, Beast, Corrupted, and Lost. These are all 100% useless for PvP, which is why they're in the F tier. Of course, with the upcoming patch and mutators, there are going to be uses for them, right? Do with this info what you want, but for now I've put them in the F tier because this is PvP focused, and for PvP they're 100% useless, but they're not going to make your weapon worthless or anything. Like Angry Earthbane, it's great for clearing out Genesis in no time at all. Then we have Unkill. Now everything related to Unkill is useless in PvP, because Unkill procs assume that you get the last hit after the person has been dropped. So these are great for PvE, some of them, but useless for PvP. Mortal Refreshment, Power, Energy, Fortification, Siphoning, and Lifesteal. 4.8% HP on kill. How often do you just shoot into a group of people and just get 3 last hits in a row, right? It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. And lastly, in the F tier, we have things like Threat, Hated, and Kind. Again, the amount of threat you generate, useless for PvP. So lastly, what do you do when you're crafting weapons? Well, first of all, you need to identify what the best perk, in your opinion, is for that given weapon. I haven't extensively played with all weapons, and so I can't tell you exactly what is best for every single weapon with 100% certainty, but in my opinion the list would look something like this. And keep in mind that I have played most weapons all the way up to level 20, with the exception of the sword and shield, the hatchet, and the life staff. But I do know from every healer I've ever talked to that Blessed is simply the almighty lord of all perks for life staffs. So my list would look something like this, in no particular order necessarily for any given weapon. For the Great Axe, the Warhammer, and the Hatchet, in my personal opinion, Thwarting Strikes is the single best perk you can get, followed closely by Enchanted and Keen. As for the Spear and Rapier, I personally think you want to go for Refreshing Move. That's my personal favorite, especially for the Rapier, simply because it allows you to get a bunch of cooldown reductions so you can escape. I think it's also really great for the Spear because it has so much CC, and having Refreshing Move on it is just going to help you keep people completely locked down, but you can also go for something like Enchanted if you feel like it. As for the Fire Staff, Ice Gauntlet, and Void Gauntlet, you probably want to have some combination of either cooldown reduction perks, crit perks, Enchanted, or possibly even the life-stealing perk for the Void Gauntlet. As for the shield, I know Sturdy is the one perk that I'm familiar with that I know you want to have on your shield. As for the sword, I actually have no idea. I tried looking it up, but I couldn't find any good resource. As for the bow and the musket, you want to go for either headshot damage, Enchanted, or crit damage. I think for the musket, headshot damage is more important than crit damage, whereas for the bow, I would probably go for crit damage over headshot damage. Or you could just go for Enchanted, of course. And at the time of recording this ending, I really want to finish the video, and so apologies to all sword and shield users out there. I hope you can forgive me, but we're gonna move on. Anyways, I would give you guys a summary, but I feel like this video is already close enough to hitting the 1 hour mark, so I'm not going to. I hope you guys can forgive me for that, but this video was so much work, so I really hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you so much to anyone that made it all the way through. Like, Jesus fuck. What am I doing? Please like, comment, and subscribe, because I will never ever put this much effort into another video ever again. I'm just kidding, I will. But maybe I should just do like everyone else and just click record and start talking and pretend like I know stuff about stuff. Wow, life must be so easy for those people. In any case, in a video this long and this complex, I would personally be completely mind-baffled if there weren't some inaccuracies, some flaws here and there. It's very, very difficult to avoid. Trust me, I have done my best to look through it. I've done my research, so I stand by what I've said, but that doesn't mean that there can't be any mistakes or inaccuracies. And if you find any, if you hear any, if you're like, nope, PK, that's not correct. I know better, that's my main weapon, you know, XYZ, then feel free to let me know down in the comments below, and I will gladly sort of make a little list of pinned things, assuming that I've missed some things. And yeah, other than that, I just want to say thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it. You are a god for getting through this behemoth of a video. And as always, I love you guys. Stay awesome. Peace out. Full 1 hour video of edited footage. That's like writing Lord of the Rings of YouTube videos, right? It's like the Lord of the Rings of YouTube videos, okay? Bruh.